You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Throughout the immigrant experience, we have seen how workers gain respect with employment, and everyone is committed to work when decently employed. So immigrant workers throughout history are following the logic of where wealth can be redistributed. And unions have always asked for decency in meeting subsistence needs. And every immigrant community that is now part of the American social fabric develops strategies to improve their immigrant community's struggle to survive. A sense of awareness and a commitment to immigrant rights and responsibilities have always been a part of the naturalization process. So last week we covered the tug of war between racial and cultural bigots and industrial lobbyists over what to do with the Mexican. Immigrants' labor struggles to achieve a decent wage during and after World War I was followed in the 1920s by a conservative reaction to progressive reform and socialist organizing. During the 1920s, the United States witnessed a rise of a narcissistic consumer culture in the midst of jazz, women's rights, prohibition, and government scandal. And we left off with events that led to the repatriation of Mexicans in increasing numbers, as they were the first to be blamed for the greatest economic meltdown the world had ever experienced. And this was a meltdown known as the Great Depression. So as the era came to a close, historians see that the maldistribution of income was a significant factor that contributed to the Great Depression. Many American businesses misrepresented their assets to obtain loans, and as a result, they were overburdened with debt. Now, the prevailing thought in 1929 concerning economic depressions was that economic downturns are natural and simply must be allowed to run their course. Whereas before downturns were related to overproduction, now underconsumption was caused by falling wages and rising unemployment. So that by 1929, many Americans could no longer buy the products they needed and wanted. The stock market crash of 1929, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression, came directly from wild speculation, which collapsed and brought the whole economy down. So the bubble of prosperity that was built on the mini-industrial revolution, where new industries around consumer goods were built around consumer goods, that bubble burst. On October 1st, 1929, there occurred a massive fall in the stock market, which caused a run on the banks. Now, the boom of the mid-1920s, based on housing and automobiles, slowed. But despite the lack of demand, overproduction continued. Accountants manipulated the books, which led to an overspeculation in the stock market, driving the paper value of shares beyond their real value. So a spiral effect occurred in the market. If the automobile industry goes down, then steel demand goes down. Steel demand goes down, workers are laid off. Workers are laid off, then people do not buy consumer goods. And no protections were built into the economy. Economic historian John Kenneth Galbraith argues that speculation led to the crisis due to lack of regulation, unhealthy corporate and banking structures, unsound foreign trade, much economic misinformation, and the bad distribution of income, where the highest 5% of the population received about 1/3 of all personal income. This sounds familiar. But capitalism was in a crisis. And after the crash, the economy was stunned. It was barely moving. Over 5,000 banks closed, and the huge numbers of businesses unable to get money closed too. And those that continued laid off employees and cut wages of those who remained. And they did it again and again. So all over America, haphazardly created neighborhoods of shacks were built on garbage dumps. And they were called Hoovervilles. And Herbert Hoover and the Republican program did not reach out to the majority of the suffering poor. In fact, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under the Hoover administration was really designed to bail out his political patrons at the outset. It did nothing to alleviate the plight of the workers. There were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, to sell it, so it rotted. And again, if you notice my shirt, it says capitalism. When we try to understand something about capitalism, we can recognize the illogic, the sense of the emphasis on making money instead of the human condition. So you can imagine if you have millions of tons of food around, but it's not profitable to transport it. It's not profitable to sell it. So the food just stays in the fields and rots. You might have people who are hungry, but they can't go into the fields to feed themselves. You might have warehouses full of clothing, but people who can't afford it to keep warm, they freeze to death. So clothing is not redistributed. There's housing, lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people could not pay the rent. They had been evicted, and now they lived in shacks in quickly formed Hoovervilles built on garbage dumps. Last week I shared with you a clip. Let's go back to this clip and let's appreciate again the significance of Hoovervilles.
Millions of American workers lost their jobs. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Only a handful of wealthy investors profited from the collapse of the stock market, like President John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, or brilliant investor and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, who became legendary as the man who sold out before the crash. Performer and humorist Will Rogers probably put it best.
10 men in our country could buy the whole world, and 10 million can't buy enough to eat.
So the millions of less fortunate Americans faced a grim and uncertain future. Soup kitchens and bread lines became as commonplace as the flappers and speakeasies of the Roaring '20s. And Herbert Hoover's campaign promise of a chicken in every pot couldn't have been farther from the truth. America's towns and cities struggled in vain to help the thousands in need. The jobless became the homeless. Shanty towns, makeshift communities of shacks constructed from wooden crates, tar paper, and cardboard sprang up. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles after the president, and the newspapers they slept under, Hoover blankets. Others left the city to ride the rails, looking for work. Too poor to purchase train tickets, they hitched rides on freight cars, hoping they wouldn't be caught, hoping they'd find a job. Approximately 2 million men became hobos, wandering the countryside looking for work. Between 1929 and 1932, roughly 400,000 farms were foreclosed when farmers couldn't pay their mortgages and banks repossessed the property. Thousands of farm families became migrant workers, following crop harvests to eke out a living. Then, to make matters even worse, drought, coupled with the overproduction of crops in the Great Plains, turned the area from Texas to Oklahoma into a dust bowl. In 1934, strong winds blew tons of dust from the plains all the way to the East Coast. Dust even coated New York City and settled on ships 500 miles out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean. Unemployment and poverty hurt everyone, especially children. Many left school to work and help their families survive, and many more went hungry and malnourished. Diet-related illnesses like rickets and scoliosis became all too common. Once again, President Hoover tried to reassure the nation by saying, recovery is just around the corner. But it was not to be, and more Americans grew disenchanted with his policies and administration. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon echoed the beliefs of most of Hoover's advisors, that the economy would recover on its own. Hoover thought the government must take some action, but feared making government too strong, and so he chose a conservative approach, calling together business, banking, and labor leaders and urging them to work together and avoid laying off workers or calling strikes. Then he authorized the expenditure of federal funds for large public works projects, like Boulder Dam, later renamed Hoover Dam, to create jobs and wages for thousands of workers. Hoover felt giving direct help to needy Americans would undermine their self-respect and looked to private charities to help the hungry. Instead, he approved more than $2 billion in emergency financing to businesses. hoping their renewed success would trickle down to the people who needed assistance. It didn't. Rather, unemployment rose even higher, and Americans were caught in a web of despair.
All right, crew, let's see if you can get my shirt this time for the students to see. I don't know which camera. Should I go into this camera over here? Yes, there we go. There we go. You see there, capitalism, in this particular case, capital isn't. Let's appreciate something about the Great Depression. And again, this is the struggle that, what we're seeing is the second generation of immigrants that have been coming into the United States. Now they're coming of age in the 1930s, and then now they're struggling to survive. And let's understand something about the immigrant who gave up his life to fight in World War I for the United States, because as the Great Depression evolved, the anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to what eventually is going to be called by historians the March of the Bonus Army to Washington. And they did that in the spring and summer of 1932. World War I veterans migrated to Washington, D.C. from all over the country to demand redress. So we're going to visit a documentary that is entitled The March of the Bonus Army, that's sponsored by the Disabled American Veterans. Let's go to the documentary.
America was not prepared when it entered World War I in 1917. Fighting the Germans required young American men by the millions, and the only way to get them was through conscription.
The American Army, for the first time in its history, will be composed of a majority of conscripted troops. And when the draft is explained to the American people, it's called selective service.
Some men were selected to fight, others to work in needed defense industries, or as farmers.
So it's a different conception of military service as work, as opposed to just simply a civic duty.
The first American troops arrived in France in June of 1917. In just 18 months, nearly 100,000 lost their lives. 200,000 more were wounded or gassed. Also, over there, were hundreds of thousands of African American soldiers. Barred from combat with American units, many fought courageously under the French flag.
For the first time, many of these people experienced what it was like to be treated as fully human beings by white people.
When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, most of the Americans that had served would never be the same. As the first waves of troops returned from Europe, the nation turned out to honor them with parades. But veterans quickly realized the high price they had paid.
Let's say a guy didn't go to war, stayed home, worked in an arms factory. He would probably get maybe 10 times as much as a soldier would. Soldier in combat was getting about a buck and a quarter a day.
Soon after the war, veterans began to argue that soldiers should be compensated for the wages they lost while serving their country.
They very carefully used the terms adjusted compensation to be clear that what they are asking for is not a bonus, they are asking for back wages that are due to them. It was the detractors who called it a bonus.
Finally, in 1924, Congress granted World War I veterans adjusted universal compensation.
A law had granted them the bonus, equivalent to $1 to $1.25 a day for every day they served, which in many cases would be $600, $800, $1,000.
But there was a catch.
They don't get a nickel of the money until 1945, unless they die. That's what they call it, the tombstone bonus.
In 1928, Herbert Clark Hoover, a self-made millionaire, was elected president. In his inaugural address, Hoover proclaimed that the future of the country was bright with hope. Just 7 months later, the stock market collapsed, and the country descended into the Great Depression. In America, In 1932, hunger and desperation stalked the land. 25% of workers were unemployed, and many were veterans. One of them was Walter W. Waters, down on his luck in Portland, Oregon.
He had been a sergeant in the war, and that's an indication that you were a pretty good soldier. And there were a lot of veterans sitting around trying to find what to do next.
Then came a ray of hope. A bill calling for an immediate cash payment of the veterans' bonus was introduced in Congress. Waters became obsessed with it.
During this time, I was anxiously watching reports in the newspapers of the progress of bonus legislation. And I noticed that the highly organized lobbies in Washington were producing results regardless of the justice or injustice of the demand.
At a meeting of jobless veterans, Waters stood up and urged them to march on Washington.
And when that happened, it kind of clicked for these guys. Eventually, there were about 300 of them. And they go down to the railroad yard to hop freights. And they go all the way across the country to Washington.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run.
They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF, a play on the American Expeditionary Force, the collective name for the troops sent to France. But soon, they were simply known as the Bonus Army. They carried knapsacks, or duffel bags, or bedrolls, with tin cups dangling. They had $30 among them. Meanwhile, word of the BEF was spreading. Even as Waters and his men were heading towards the Capitol, 25 vets from Tennessee were circling the White House in a truck bearing the sign, "We want our bonus."
And they start from everywhere. They start from Los Angeles. They start from Las Vegas. They start from Mississippi and Texas. They come from everywhere.
Antonio Oliver, a veteran gassed in the Argonne Forest in France, drove from Pennsylvania with his twin sons, Nick and Joe.
My dad got word to march on Washington and dump the tub for the bonus that they promised the veterans in 1924.
And I think it was approaching dawn when he got there. And my father woke us up and says, "There's the Capitol building." I never forgot that.
Okay. As the film clip reveals, war veterans holding government bonus certificates which were due in 1945, years into the future, demanded Congress pay them off now when the money was desperately needed. And as historian Jennifer Keene emphasizes, it was called selective service. And what they wanted, and she insisted, and she understands what the soldiers insisted, was adjusted compensation. It was not a bonus. They wanted to be paid for their service. And so they began to migrate to Washington from all over the country with their families or alone. And they came in broken down old autos, they stole rides on freight trains, or they hitchhiked. Now, historian Howard Zinn writes that they were immigrant miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed immigrant Polish veterans from Chicago. And more than 20,000 came. And John Dos Passos described their encampment across the Potomac River from the Capitol in a place called Anacostia Flats. He wrote that the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scraped together out of the city dump. And the bill to pay off on the bonus passed the House, but is going to be defeated in the Republican Senate. And then President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to evict them. So clearly, capitalism is capital isn't. Let's go back to the documentary and see what happened to the Bonus Army.
While streams of bonus marchers headed toward the Capitol, Pelham Glassford, the new D.C. police chief, prepared for their invasion.
I had been aware from the first that the BEF was symbolic of the vast army of unemployed. Anything unfortunate that happened might easily precipitate widespread social disorder.
Helen Glassford was a decorated brigadier general during World War I who commanded the loyalty of his men in a very personal way.
Glassford was really pleased in many ways that the veterans were coming to Washington. But he knew that the politicians were not sympathetic.
Officials were also concerned that a large number of African American veterans were mixed in with the marchers.
And the irony is that going back to the Great War, the African American troops were segregated from the white troops.
Also preparing for the Bonus Army was a prominent World War I veteran, General Douglas A. MacArthur.
The United States Army, through its Military Intelligence Division, remained greatly concerned about the possibility of revolution. The Army developed a plan to defend the United States Capitol in the case of civil insurrection. And they were talking about using tanks, machine guns, gas.
By the time the Bonus Marchers arrived in Washington, the Army was more than ready to deal with them. At the end of May 1932, nearly 10,000 Bonus Marchers occupied the nation's capital, and tens of thousands more were on their way. Police Chief Glassford realized he was on his own.
They followed their leaders in the childlike faith that their government would help them, just as they had responded during the war. Hence, I felt these veterans could not be treated like bums.
On June 4th, thousands of Washingtonians lined the streets to see what the Washington Post called the strangest military parade the Capitol had ever witnessed. The BEF was marching in full force. Within days, Walter Waters had a full-fledged lobbying operation underway.
The veterans frankly made a nuisance of themselves. A couple of veterans were always sitting in each representative's waiting rooms. The representatives were solicited outside the building as well.
The strategy quickly paid off. After just 2 weeks, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill. The BEF had won a battle, but a greater one awaited them in the Senate. In a remote neighborhood of Washington known as Anacostia, an enormous tent and shack city rose from the mudflats. Here, the threadbare heroes of World War I formed their last great encampment.
We just drove in and we were ankle deep in mud. I never saw so much mud in my life.
American flags could be seen flying from every possible vantage point.
A city was laid out in Anacostia. The streets were named by states. There was a library in the center of it run by the Salvation Army. There was music day and night. There was gospel music, and there was blues music, and there was country music, and popular music. There are people who built beautiful little replicas of suburban homes. There were guys who were buried alive for money.
I well remember the veteran laying in a casket, saying, hey, they treat us like we were dead people.
A popular form of entertainment in the camp was boxing.
I was the best boxer. I was. We boxed. We'd pass the hat. My dad would get a little irate if we didn't really punch each other out. Then he'd throw up both of our arms. It was always a draw, always a draw, always a draw.
People across the country sympathized with the Bonus Marchers' plight. But to official Washington, they were just a sign of trouble on the horizon. One of the stories that went largely unreported was that the color line seemed to have vanished in the Bonus Army camps. Visitors were astonished to see black veterans and white veterans sharing billets, chores, and rations.
The military experience has the potential for transcending things like race. And for black veterans to be in company with white veterans was a revolutionary thing.
Roy Wilkins, an enterprising young reporter working for the NAACP, decided to visit and see for himself.
At Anacostia, there was no residential segregation. Recruits of any color were made welcome.
It was a big event in the part of the city that I lived in. They had groups of whites and Negroes that formed a unit because they were from the same state. That was not so usual for the city of Washington.
And there were lots of people, especially people in the military, who saw this as a very, very dangerous thing.
And right there was the tragedy of it all. Men can live, eat, play, and work together, be they black or white, just as the BEF demonstrated.
On June 17, 1932, thousands of bonus marchers assembled on Capitol Hill to maintain a vigil on the Senate, scheduled to vote on the bonus bill passed by the House. The shouts and songs of the veterans, "The Yanks are starving! The Yanks are starving!" could be heard in the Senate chamber as the heated debate went on. Late in the day, Waters delivered the result to his troops.
The Senate overwhelmingly defeated the bonus bill, and the men were extraordinarily disappointed. But fortunately, a newspaper reporter suggested to Waters that he ought to order the men to sing America. And they did. They all sang America, and they dispersed peacefully.
But Waters urged the marchers to remain in Washington.
I am not advising anybody to go home. We intend to maintain our army in Washington regardless of who goes home.
President Hoover and other people kept saying, why can't we drive them home? A lot of these people didn't have a home.
It was pretty clear to everybody that they could not remain. But no one knew how to get rid of them, and no one wanted violence.
On July 16th, the last day Congress was in session, Washington was on edge. Thousands of angry veterans surrounded the Capitol. Near midnight, the 72nd Congress adjourned. Congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid confrontations. The situation had come to a head. The president ordered the evacuation of the veterans from downtown Washington. By police count, there were still 11,698 marchers and their families in Washington. Midway between the White House and the Capitol stood a row of half-demolished buildings where hundreds of marchers were living. On the morning of July 28th, the wheels were in motion to evict them. Waters urged his men to cooperate. Then someone began to throw bricks at the police.
Glassford and several police officers run to the area. Two cops are grabbed. One cop pulls out a gun and he fires. Another cop turns and he fires a shot.
One veteran was dead and another lay dying.
Now there's been bloodshed. Now you bring in the troops.
When MacArthur moved his troops to the affected area, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he adorned himself in his dress uniform along with his major aide, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The force stepped off at 4:30 p.m. More than 200 cavalrymen spread out across Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues. Behind them came 400 infantrymen, followed up by tanks and armored vehicles.
I was about 7 years old at the time, and the troops were out on Pennsylvania Avenue. I was scared, and my dad kept saying, nothing's going to happen.
The cavalrymen, one of whom is Major Patton, have got their sabers out.
The soldiers donned gas masks and without warning began hurling gas grenades at the veterans. The troops advanced, some jabbing with bayonets.
Tear gas was just burning my face. I was trailing behind my dad, and he kept hollering, "Come on, boy, come on, boy."
Marchers were choking from the gas, just like the battlefields in France.
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
Chief Glassford stood by helplessly.
The veterans did not believe the country for which they had fought would ignore the plight into which the Depression had placed them. Many did not believe that United States troops would take the field against them.
By early evening, most of the marchers had been driven across a drawbridge that led to their main camp.
The president does not want MacArthur to cross the bridge, and MacArthur disregards the order. Eisenhower later says that he saw this happen. MacArthur says, "I cannot bother with pieces of paper during a military operation." And so he crosses the bridge.
All through the camp were scenes of panic.
My dad says, "Let's get the hell out of here. The soldiers are going to kill us."
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
Wow. Can you imagine World War II soldiers practicing on World War I veterans prior to defeating Hitler? 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and tanks were assembled to oust the bonus army. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operations. Major Dwight Eisenhower, his aide, George Patton, one of the officers. So as the film clip revealed, MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue and used tear gas to clear the veterans out of old buildings and set the buildings on fire. Then MacArthur led the army across the bridge to Anacostia, and there the soldiers destroyed the entire encampment. So Washington was on fire, and it was all over. 2 veterans had been shot to death, and an 11-week-old baby had died, and an 8-year-old boy was blinded by gas. 2 police had fractured skulls, and 1,000 veterans were injured by the gas. So, again, the hard times of the Depression and the inaction of the government to help the people became exacerbated by the dispersal of war veterans. And the majority of these war veterans were immigrants or children of immigrants. And in the election of November 1932, Democratic Party candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to defeat Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly, one of the most lopsided defeats in presidential elections.